Okay, well, welcome back to the Hortman. This week brought me a whole new plethora of things to look at. First, I wanted to touch on something that we discussed last week, and that was ants and termites. This summer here in Carroll County, at least, is interesting because we have kind of an unusual weather pattern. It started dry there in the spring, but we've had a series of rains, which is great, helps the plants, and cooling periods. And with that cycle of rain and cooling periods, it tends to trigger what we call kind of blooms of termites and flying ants. And a lot of people get confused, and understandably so, because some of the times it's hard to differentiate. And I talked a little bit about how they look, at least how to differentiate them, but I also brought in a specimen mount that I found under my desk. This is something that probably has been there for 20 years, and I was wondering what the box was and opened it up and said, hey, this is great. What we have are collected samples of termites and ants. The ant is a little misleading because it's probably a carpenter ant, but the thing that I wanted to show you that helps differentiate ants and termites is, and I find very noticeable, is the relative length of the wings to the body for the termite and the relative length of the wings to the body for the ant. And as you can see, hopefully, these are very small termites, but termites are about this size, at least the reproductive flyers. The body length is about half the length of the total wing length. So you can see these wings extend quite a bit beyond the length of the body. Whereas with flying ants, the wings just go a little bit beyond. They're not even probably 1/3 the length in addition to the body, whereas these are at least double the length of the body. So that's the big noticeable difference. Of course, you can pull out your magnifying glass and then start looking at antenna structure and maybe even the body segments. It's hard to see, but with, at least on this, the termite body has a fused body, whereas the ant has very distinct body segments, kind of like a wasp. They talk about thread waves. You'll see that on ants. And then at the very bottom are some lookalikes that kind of get thrown into this third group I call parasitic wasps, and these are a lot of the small kind of single nesting wasps or solitary wasps, and they look kind of like an ant or a termite, but again, you can see they have a thread waist, and the wings do not extend any much. Really, they extend just to the end of the body. So the big factor is the length of the wings for termites. They're at least twice the length, if not longer. With, again, the weather cycle, we've had all sorts of blooms. People don't think of mushrooms as blooms, but really these are the fruiting bodies of typically underground funguses. I'm quite sure this week, as the weather's finally cooled off, and we just finished with a pretty good series of storms, quite destructive actually in some areas, especially down toward Montgomery County. A lot of these things are popping up in mulch piles and in people's lawns. The big thing in lawns is people think, why are they in the lawn? Usually it's a result of decomposing organic matter, primarily wood. And some people talk about something called fairy rings, and these are all of a sudden this great ring of mushrooms popping up in the middle of the lawn. It almost looks like a perfect circle, or even a very dark green band. It looks like somebody's doing some strange crop circle. That's usually the fungus creating those rings, and you'll see many times in that ring a whole row of these funguses just going around and creating a circle or a semicircle. Not a lot you can do. Fungicides won't kill these things. Probably the best thing to do is take your lawnmower out if you're worried about your animals and have them and just cut those things off. They dry up very quickly so the animals won't consume them. There is not just one species of mushroom that's out there. There's hundreds, thousands of them in Carroll County. So it's very hard to identify what's edible, what isn't, what's poisonous, what isn't. So if our weather cycle continues where we get lots of rain and then that cooling period that typically shows up after the rain, expect to see these things. I guess if you're really maniacal and you wanted to give your neighbor something to talk about, you would take you would go out there and start digging up the decomposing roots that are causing this. But there is good information online. There's several websites that we're listing that can give you good information on these fairy rings and the mushroom blooms. I predicted it last week. It was an easy prediction because most of my entomologists at College Park told me Japanese beetles are definitely bigger this year. I didn't even bring any in to show off because most people know what they look like, or they can look outside on their roses or linden trees or what else, grapevines, and they're going to see Japanese beetles. So populations are definitely higher this year. We've had lots of calls from the Eldersburg area and Tawnytown area. At this point, control is difficult. There are several traditional chemicals that people will rely on, things like Sevin and pyrethroids. One of the big problems with Sevin, especially Sevin dust, is that it will affect your pollinators. So if you have roses that are infested with Japanese beetles, things like the Sevin dust can easily kill the bees as they show up. So you need to be very careful with these products, especially if you're concerned with pollinators. I always get the question, should I get the beetle traps? And the running joke is you get the beetle trap and you give it to your neighbors. Primarily because they've discovered that single beetle traps in an area tend to attract all the Japanese beetles to that one trap. And when they go to that trap, they tend to feed on their way to the trap. So the damage around the trap to trees and shrubs that Japanese beetles like to chew on can be quite high. So I usually tell people there's other ways to control them. A lot of gardeners I know just like to go out in the morning when the beetle's sluggish. It's slow to wake up. It needs the heat of the day to really get moving and eating. And they'll go out with a cup of soapy water and slowly knock those beetles in. And if you notice, if you disturb Japanese beetles, if they're on your plants, their defensive reaction is to drop and kind of roll off. And some of the times they'll hit the ground or they'll drop and fall and then start flying low. So you can use that behavior by sticking a cup underneath something that, with water, don't use gasoline. I've had people call and say, oh my God, I spilled that cup of gasoline under my rose bush, and I had to ask them, why did you have gasoline? And of course, they were thinking outside the box. So use something safe, again, like soapy water, and all you need is a very mild dilution. Products like neem work pretty well as a deterrent, and that's a type of oil that you can spray onto the roses. Many people use it as a fungicide. But the neem will deter usually Japanese beetles for about 2 to 3 days. The big question is for lawn care is, wow, should I treat my lawns with a grub deterrent? Because big populations of Japanese beetle typically mean that we're going to have large populations then of grubs that'll show up in the fall. And that is not visual in the sense that you'll see grubs crawling all over the place, but you'll see big dead patches of lawn. And if you can run over or walk over to a dead patch of lawn and lift it up like a rug or a toupee, that usually means that it was grub damage. And the most damaging grubs, at least in our area, are Japanese beetles. So right now we're seeing them flying around. They're the adults. They aren't going to be damaging the lawn, but when the female starts to lay its eggs, typically through July into early August, and those eggs then start to hatch, that's when you want to be concerned about your lawn, because as that beetle grub keeps eating, it gets fatter and fatter and starts consuming more and more of the grass. There are some parameters you can use if you're really vigilant. You can go out in August and start digging up patches of your turf, and that means just carefully taking a slice and digging underneath and then counting to see how many grubs you have. Typically about 8 grubs per square foot is what I call the threshold that warrants treatment. If you have 6 or 4 or 3 per square foot, that's not enough to cause much damage. Usually the damage that's caused will quickly will heal over as the grass regrows its roots. But when you get populations above 8 to 10, that's when you start to see significant browning. There are many good and relatively safe products that you can put down. Go to the hardware store, garden center, wherever you choose to shop, and they can give you pretty good information on those products. There's a whole list of them, and as long as you put them down according to the directions, you should get pretty good coverage. But just make sure that you follow the directions, because these are chemicals, so you don't want to overdo it or underdo it. Boy, catch of the week. I've gotten lots of people coming in with this kind of unusual but very uniform pattern of damage to their roses. And this is also showing up especially in red buds, where the leaves have this very even circular cut. This was done not by a caterpillar. You usually think of caterpillars as being the big consumers of foliage, but in this case it was done by a bee, a solitary bee called a leafcutter bee. Good name. And this bee, all it does is it cuts out a section of the leaf and then flies back to its nest. Now these are solitary creatures, so they tend to live in hollow branches or stems of grass, and use this to line that nest that they're making. Again, the action, there's not much physical damage that would hurt the health of the plant, so I wouldn't worry too much about this particular bee causing much damage. It's more aesthetic than anything. If you have a red bud, expect some damage. For some reason this year it seems as though, at least in our area, that there are higher than normal levels of these leafcutter bees, but again, the damage is insignificant to the overall health of these trees and shrubs. This came off a multiflora rose, which, good riddance. I'd love to get rid of the multiflora rose, but that's a different story. I guess a new shrub of the week that a lot of people aren't aware of, and the blossom, and it's hard to believe this is a blossom, is already fading, is called a buttonbush. This is a Maryland native, and if I'm out hiking, especially in the coastal plain where you get into some wetlands, you'll find these many times, and they can be kind of large shrubs up to 10, 12 foot tall. This particular one is well behaved. It's actually in front of the extension office. What I like about this is it's kind of the ultimate pollinator plant. Lots of bees and butterflies and wasps will show up and feed on this. And actually we have some pictures that we're looping into this vodcast, showing all the bees crawling, probably two species, a bumblebee and some honeybees, on one bloom. So they don't seem to mind it because the nectar obviously is very enticing. So a great pollinator plant to include in your garden, especially if you have a wet spot. I mentioned it's found in wetlands. This is another one of these plants that I've talked about in the past that has been dragged out of the swamps and does well in average garden soil. It isn't terribly demanding. It blooms much better in full sun, but I've seen it blooming quite well in partial shade. So if you want something different that people come over and say, boy, what is that plant? It's a buttonbush, so look for that. It's hard to find. You're not going to find this at a typical nursery. If you go to native plant shows or go online, you can probably order these plants pretty readily. Boy, I haven't brought it in. I'll save it for next week. It was Weed of the Week. There's going to be lots of weeds coming up just because of the amount of rain that we've had and the cool temperatures that keep following those rains. So we'll bring in more and more weeds in the following weeks. One thing that's caused a lot of concern, and it's put this on a lighter background, are the galls that are showing up on leaves. And galls are usually protrusions that come up out of the top of the leaf, but some of the times you'll find it growing out of the bottom of the leaf. There are some galls that are known as stem galls, and these again are kind of large, unusual looking growths on the stems of plants, even on some of the larger branches. By and large, galls I throw into a category called not to worry. These are typically caused by very small mites or very small, mites or very small wasps. And what's kind of cool about a gall is it usually does not hurt the overall health of the plant. There's only one I can think of, and that's on an oak tree. But these mites and wasps have a neat biology set up, and these galls are actually kind of miniature nests. And what the mite or the wasp will do is inject a little growth hormone into the leaf, which causes the leaf to grow this unusual cylinder. And then within each one of these little galls or cylinders, in this case, these are spindle galls, is usually a small egg that will hatch into a larvae, and that larvae will develop inside this protected little habitat. Looks a little ugly, but again, when you look at the overall health of the entire tree or shrub, it usually doesn't cause much damage. Let's see, anything else we can talk about today? I think that wraps it up. We're going to have some fact sheets listed with each of these items, so that's it for today. To follow us, subscribe below or like us on social media. We'll work on this. We'll do this each time. Eventually I'll get it.